Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our next Nomensa webinar instalment, hosted by Principal UX Designer here, Emily Trotter. In today's webinar, Emily is going to be joined by Chris, our Creative Director, and Matt, our Head of Development. They're going to be exploring how we can design in a more sustainable way. Emily's going to update on what's happened in sustainable design since her planet-centered design talk at Interact London 2023, and explore what has and hasn't worked when applying sustainable design thinking in practice. We are using auto-generated captions from Rev today. There is a chance that some of these might get a little bit muddled live, but we'll make sure that they're all tidied up when we post the recording on our YouTube channel tomorrow. As always, please do say hello to each other in the chat. Just make sure you select panelists and attendees from the drop down. That way everyone can see your messages. If you've got any questions for Emily, Chris, or Matt at the end, you can submit those using either the Q&A feature or just drop them in the chat, and I'll try and get through as many as I can at the end. So yeah, over to you, Emily, to get started.
Cool. Thanks, Henry. Yeah, so for a year or so now, I've been on this kind of journey of research into sustainable digital design. Like Henry mentioned, back in October last year, I spoke at Interact London to share what I'd found and to kind of spread the word and hopefully raise some awareness of this kind of mostly unchecked digital pollution problem. And also to talk about what we can do as designers and as product owners to understand and reduce these emissions. So in this webinar, I kind of want to talk a little bit about what's happened in this kind of fast changing corner of technology, and also talk about how it's been bringing these new techniques and methods into our practice as a digital agency. So I'm not going to get too much into the why, because that was a really big focus of my previous talk. And hopefully everyone here is kind of aware of sustainability and the importance of it. Like, I'm sure you wouldn't have signed up if you weren't. So, but as you know, I'll do a bit of a quick recap just to refresh everybody's minds. So the internet represents around 3 to 5% of global emissions. So if it was a country, it would be one of the world's top 5 carbon polluters, and that's expected to keep growing considerably. If you think about like the number of people using the internet and also the amount of time they spend using the internet daily, both of those numbers are growing, and going to be growing considerably by like 2030. The rise of generative AI and other like emerging technologies, they're also kind of accelerating these problems. So how do websites produce carbon? It comes down to data. So energy is used to store data, to transfer the data, and by the end user to consume data. So it's a really complex system, but as a kind of general rule, the more data that's transferred and the more energy used, and the longer somebody is spending consuming that data, the bigger the carbon footprint is going to be. So it's all about data and the resulting consumption of resources, and that, resources, it's energy, but it's also water as well. There's, it's not kind of limited to one type. So in order to reduce how much of these resources are being used, we need to make each journey and each interaction as like efficient as possible. But as well as efficiency, we've also got to consider the bigger picture and be mindful of this kind of paradox called the rebound effect, when in the long term, an increase in efficiency in resource use generates this increase in resource consumption. So the example that I like here is the email. So emails are seen or were seen as this kind of efficient replacement for physical letters, saving resources like across the paper supply chain and the delivery chain. But with 8.3 billion emails sent per day in the UK, that's like 124 per person per day. The unintended consequence here of that increase in efficiency of resource use has led to this going way beyond like swapping writing a letter for writing an email. The average person isn't going to be writing 124 letters per day. So that's kind of a simplified example of that, of the rebound effect. And in simpler terms, when things are quick, easy, and cheap, we consume more of them. So the good news is that UX design, as this kind of blend of disciplines collaborating together, is perfectly placed to understand that relationship between digital design and physical effect. And we do this by understanding the energy consumption to build more efficient products, digital products, and then being mindful of that rebound effect to design resilient digital products by, understanding our users and our products, and what are the products and services enabling them to do, what behavior change might there be, or what products they're using. So it's kind of both sides of the coin. UX design is spread across all of it. So what's happening out there then? Well, web sustainability is moving kind of rapidly into mainstream. And I think that this is kind of powered by this pincer movement of individuals wanting to make a difference, as well as regulation being put in place. Like France and Germany already have legislation around digital sustainability. The EU are passing a climate disclosure regulation, as is California. And these have been kind of primarily focused on the more physical aspects that are like easier to see and quantify, such as the production and commerce of like tech and devices, like the physical stuff. And then also, at the other end of the spectrum, the e-waste, these are kind of filling up landfills as well. But the digital emissions of products and services like websites, streaming, cloud software, the stuff we're talking about today, all of the less visible and less tangible pollution is also starting to fall under these kind of scope 3 emissions. And we're going to see that beginning to be included in these regulations. So moving on to getting practical, it's really promising to see big players starting to get on board with this. So Google have produced their own green software guides. Big brands like Unilever are putting together digital sustainability statements, talking about the steps they're taking to like measure and reduce their digital impact. Services like WeTransfer are sort of starting to understand that to be competitive in their marketplace, they've got to demonstrate that they understand the impact of using their services, and kind of passing that knowledge on to their customers to help them choose, who they want to go with, in this case, where they want to advertise. And then we're also seeing innovations in gov.uk, who are beginning to like integrate digital sustainability into their guidelines. So there's all great stuff going on, big players kind of talking and doing stuff in this space, which is ultimately going to further the conversation for everyone else. And then to get practical yourself, resources have up until recently been quite kind of scattered, but we've got some trusted places to go now for up-to-date guidance. The Web Sustainability Guidelines from our W3C community group is a really great resource available online for anybody to use. So it's got just over 100 members, and that number's growing. The guidelines had 90 plus contributors from 15 different countries, and it's, they bring together best practices based on measurable evidence-based research. And the contributors include like UX designers like myself, web developers, environmental activists, sustainability experts, academics. So it's really coming from a wide spectrum of people and minds and practices coming together. So they explain how to design and implement digital products and services that put people and the planet first. And they're broken down into 4 areas to help individuals find the guidance relevant to their practice. So that's UX design, web development, hosting infrastructure and systems, and business strategy and product management. And then all of that together is designed to be used by a really wide range of disciplines. So all of those on the screen currently, like end users, website creators, product owners, stakeholders, tool authors, educators, and policymakers. So yeah, it's a big resource for lots of people. Now, the guidelines themselves are really in depth. Each one includes like lots of resources and tools and suggested measurement techniques, as well as like effort and impact ratings. So as a body of work, the amount of content can initially be sort of overwhelming to look at. And having dug into the guidelines, I wanted to recognize that it can be kind of hard to know where to begin, where to focus your time and effort. So for that reason, that's what I thought would be a good use of time for the second part of this webinar, where I want to focus on what we've been up to at Nomensa, where we've been putting our sustainable design thinking into practice, because I think like leading by example is like a powerful way to move forwards. I'm really hoping that sharing some of these stories will help to provide context and understanding and inspire other people to start their journeys into this too. But yeah, I guess it's worth mentioning that advice should be kind of contextual and personal to you and your product and service. So this isn't a one size fits all situation. So my advice would be to kind of listen and think about what tips you want to take away and what you want to try yourself, get involved and get exploring. So in practice, I found there are 3 themes that have kind of emerged with this. The first one being collaboration. So this is like absolutely key, as we've discussed, like sustainable design is about building efficient products and resilient products, and working alone is going to leave too many gaps in that puzzle. The process includes loads of like different disciplines. So to take that holistic view, you've got to build this community of skills that kind of overlap and complement each other to be greater than the sum of their parts. And the second theme is exploration. So a lot of these practices are still emerging. It's a really exciting time for designers because new ways of doing things are required. It's time to like explore different ideas and challenge assumptions and get your hands dirty. So from a design point of view, this could be exploring different methods of like saving an image to reduce its size, or trying different design softwares to do that, and different techniques, and comparing the results and building up this bank of knowledge from experience, which leads me on to the third theme, which is curiosity. So during that exploration, always stay curious, like why did one technique work better this time than it did on the previous attempt? Why was something successful, or why was it not successful? What was it about the specific asset or that piece of code that made it good or bad in this situation? And this curiosity is really crucial when it comes to measuring carbon. So there are lots of different models out there that allow you to scan a web page and tell you a carbon estimate per visit. They generally estimate carbon emissions by measuring the data transfer when you load a web page, like calculating the amount of electricity associated and then converting this into a figure for CO2. So each model varies slightly in the way it calculates and converts, and there's currently no standardized or agreed upon measurement method. So Tim Frick made me aware of this quote from Chris Adams, which I find really useful to keep in mind for the present circumstances of there being no standardized methodology. All models are wrong, some are useful. So to get under the skin a little bit of that, if you imagine each model uses this kind of chain of assumptions, those assumptions are really well evidenced and built by like experts who know, they know what they're doing, but they're still assumptions at the end of the day, and they've got to be in order to provide any sort of estimate. So measuring emissions means piecing together this complex internet ecosystem. And as an example, I ran the Nike website homepage through a couple of different checkers. And as you can see, like the estimations of CO2 per page visit vary. Each one's correct to its own model and assumptions, but can't be taken at face value without understanding the methodology behind it. So this data is really useful as a starting point, but being aware of the assumption being made to fill those gaps is really key as well. Calculators like EcoGrader and website Carbon Calculator are really transparent about their methodology and actively encourage people to kind of understand that. So yeah, with a bit of digging, you can find out how they're doing their calculations. So I would advise you can use the numbers to aim towards reducing consumption, and then also aim to personalize the results. So use the calculators with this curiosity of how they work and where their gaps and assumptions are, and combine that with like a personal knowledge of your tech, your third parties and your users, their locations, their habits and devices. And then you can start swapping out the assumptions with real data where you can, where you're able. So work collaboratively to explore these solutions and stay curious about the results. So, all right, let's move on to some of these examples in practice then. So I've got 4 areas that I want to explore to provide examples of like a range of different activities we've got going on. And yeah, I'm going to call on a couple of colleagues to talk through the decisions they've made and the work they've produced. So yeah, the examples cover kind of hosting, development, branding, design, and also a bit of service design in there too. So for the first example, I'm going to call on Matt Wilkes, Head of Development here. And to go back to last year, the first time I ran Nomensa's website through the carbon calculator, I was kind of horrified to see this bog standard energy result. Like, how could we be making such an error? And I went straight to the top, straight confronted Matt, who proceeded to explain to me really calmly why we've chosen to use Amazon Web Services, AWS, and that's for sustainable reasons amongst other requirements. So I'm calling this one why AWS scores badly for hosting and why we still choose to use it. So over to you, Matt, if you don't mind.
Absolutely. Thank you, Emily. So I think the most important thing to realize with these calculators is that one of the assumptions that they have had to make is that everything that happens behind the scenes is a black box, because it's very difficult to tell from loading a website what the underlying details of the hosting are. You can usually get some information. So you can usually find out what hosting provider it is, and often what part of the hosting provider it is, either what service or what location. And that's the information that websites like this use via the Green Web Foundation's database to tell if a site is using green energy, or as they call it, bog standard energy. What they can't tell is if you've made that decision for a sustainability reason or influenced by a sustainability reason. And the thing that we're really keen on doing is reducing the computation and the work that's happening to serve a website, rather than necessarily using greener energy, where energy is still being used, but it's from a more known provenance. So the example here with AWS is that the AWS services in the UK and most other regions are completely green energy, and that is reflected in the calculator. So if you were to load up a site that is entirely hosted within the UK, then it would show up as green. But we're using the CDN, Content Delivery Network feature of AWS, which allows the site to be cached worldwide. The advantage of that is it's filled as it's needed. So as people outside the UK are browsing the site, or in different areas of the UK, then copies of the pages that have been loaded recently are kept on hand for a short period of time, so that they can be served to other people nearby who are loading it. That means that someone in Australia browsing our website, for example, if someone else has accessed it recently, it doesn't have to go back twice to the UK, have a server re-render the page and spend time and energy doing that, and then send that all the way back around the world. It can short circuit that by happening locally. The downside of that is, because it is globally distributed, it means it's basically impossible for carbon checkers and databases to know if you've got a green system overall, because you could be accessing the site from somewhere that doesn't have a green data center. And therefore, because there's a chance that it's not green, that the whole service gets marked as non-green. And that's a really important thing for us to bear in mind when we're working on this, because we could make sure that there was a green energy logo by not having that content delivery network in place, but that would significantly increase the actual amount of carbon emissions that are happening, because we're having to run a server a lot more and do a lot more work. By using a CDN, it does actually allow us to scale that compute down to 0 at times. So many of our websites will be using significantly less computing power than needed, and sometimes they can even go to the point where they're all the way off. And it's just as the site starts to get used that it then scales back up and starts turning the servers on. And if you compare that to a dedicated green hosting provider, but using a more old-fashioned method where, for example, they've still got physical servers in a rack in a building somewhere, that may be fed by 100% renewable energy, but you're still using a lot more power. So there's a balance to take into account there. And that's why we've chosen to go with the CDN and the reduce rather than offset or otherwise ameliorate that power usage there.
Nice. Yeah, so there's so many different nuances to consider and kind of balance all these different needs. And yeah, looking at where things are hosted, it's kind of blew my mind a bit when you described that to me initially. And I know I've had to come back to you to speak about it a few times again.
There's some really interesting resources. There's some electricity maps will give you a map of the world and give you the carbon emissions of individual areas of countries, and lots of hosting providers have this information as well. And that gives you this factor, which on websites like Website Carbon, it has 2 factors it uses. It has a green factor, which is the average of all green electricity worldwide, and it has a standard, which is the average of all standard electricity worldwide. And having that extra information, that allows you to do that personalization, as you were saying, of being able to tell, well, 95% of my power usage is in the UK, so I can get a more accurate estimate of converting the power to carbon than I get by default.
Nice. Yeah, I kind of think of it a bit like a mortgage calculator. Like you kind of get your yardstick estimate online on one of those, you type in a few details, but it's not till you actually speak to a mortgage advisor and start talking about your personal situation and stuff, and they're taking all this into account, that you get like sometimes a dramatically different kind of result from it. So cool. Yeah, great example of using the calculator, but staying curious about the result and working out what's best for your specific use case. So the second example is another one for you, Matt, but how example of how the answer can be very simple, but the challenge is kind of spotting the problem in the first place and then seizing the opportunity to make a change. So this one is around our work on the Noley Council website relating to the sizing of news story images. I believe they're being kind of pulled in from an external source. So could you tell us about like the process here that led to that kind of simple code change?
Yeah, absolutely. So you're 100% correct. This is a website using local gov Drupal, which is a distribution of the Drupal content management system. And that has built-in support for news and image handling that does things like scaling the image to the right size. This all uses a technique called responsive images. And the idea there is that dependent on what device you're using and the size of the window and various other factors, if you're using a Retina display on a Mac, for example, versus a low resolution budget smartphone, then it can decide what the appropriate size of image to load is. Therefore, you don't have to load in very large images when you're showing something on a small screen, because actually people aren't going to be able to make it out. And as I say, it's a very simple thing to set up if you've got the infrastructure in place, and local gov Drupal does provide that. However, with the Noley website, we were pulling in news from external news aggregation systems. So we built that, set it all up, hooked it up, did testing on it, and everything seemed fine. The surprise came a little while later. What we did was we made sure that we were running our own Website Carbon checker systems quite regularly. They use the same methodology as the websitecarbon.com site that you mentioned earlier, but it's just set up in a way that we can run it in a really simple way and record the results rather than clicking on and refreshing on the website whenever we're interested in more information. And we found from that actually The emissions information was scaling like quite a lot. It was fluctuating up and down significantly, and it wasn't happening in a way that was correlated with software or infrastructure changes to the website. So that was immediately a bit of a warning sign that it might be content related. And ideally, what you want to do is build systems that don't allow content authors to make the wrong decision. So we wouldn't allow someone to create inaccessible content, and equally we shouldn't allow people to create content that is that harming the green credentials of the website. And from that hint, we could say, okay, something's not right here. We had a look and we found out that the images that were being pulled in from the external aggregator didn't correctly have the responsive attribute set up. I think actually we're still about to deploy it. So if you were to check now, they still wouldn't, but hopefully in the next few days they will do, because that code is right hot off the presses. But that's something that we wouldn't have found if we'd just done a one-shot like fire and forget check of the website. It was only by checking it regularly we found out they were fluctuating, and that's what really showed us it was content. And that was what allowed us to find it. And it was just pure bad luck that when we were doing the initial development, the things that were being pulled in had relatively small images. And by doing it regularly, we found actually there's some large ones, and there was a very large difference in there that we could use to find a very small change. I think it ended up being a 2-line change to the website code, which could massively reduce that. And this is a really good source of improvement for your sort of BAU backlog of being able to monitor things and find bugs that you would not otherwise have found, and also find opportunities for improvement that you might not have found as the site evolves.
Yeah, so there's a couple of things that occurred to me there. One, it's kind of what you were talking about at the end there, about how this is kind of a journey and something that needs to be integrated to BAU, and it's not just you do a fix and you wipe your hands and walk away, which is the same for loads of different technology. Really, everything's kind of changing and updating. You've got to keep an eye on stuff, and I think that is really key to when you're working with the guidelines, the web sustainability guidelines in general, like seeing it as it's not a to-do list that you can cross off within a week's worth of work. It's like it's a guide that you kind of need to keep implementing, and it's this kind of progress over perfection approach is really useful in this case, to just keep on top of it and like working it into your everyday practice. And it sounds as though that's something now that's kind of been worked into your development team's practice, to be kind of keeping an eye on this stuff as they're developing. And would you say that's right?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's, as you say, there's always room for improvement. It's certainly something that we are integrating a lot more, and we are monitoring things. The difficulty is in that distinction between content and code, because what we want to be able to do is see when there is a code change, like, is this going to impact the sustainability of the website in any way, in the same way that we do regression testing to check the functionality, and we might do accessibility checking or automated checks potentially to see if the accessibility, the impact. Back my connection there briefly. Do you still have me?
Yeah,
great.
Sure.
So we need to make sure that the changes that we make are having a positive impact rather than a negative impact. And we also need to be able to see what external factors are impacting the website, such as, to say, content, or just frankly finding bugs. No website is ever free of bugs, and you're very lucky if you find all of them up front. And by having a continuous check and introducing sustainability to that continuous checking, it makes it a lot more likely that you will find sustainability bugs as well as the performance, functionality, or user experience bugs that we're used to finding.
Yeah, absolutely. The other thing I kind of noticed from that is the fact that there was a third party involved as well, like pulling these in from an external source as well. So that's another thing to kind of that holistic view of what's going on. And, I think that would apply for, I'm not going to get too much into it because it's such a can of worms, but things like using AI, you've got to know how that works, how much energy that's using, and before you agree to start using these kind of third party APIs. Cool. So yeah, a nice example there of using how, well, the title I gave it was How Curiosity and Exploration Led to a CO2 Reduction, which I think is a nice kind of nutshell description of that one. So thanks so much, Matt. So you've disappeared from the screen. That's very great, you were talking through those. And now, Chris, if you're there. So the next one I want to look at is some examples of how the awareness of sustainable design techniques can positively impact like the brand and design process. So as designers, we all work within constraints of one form or another. It's part of the process of creativity, balancing the needs of the brand and the customers and the information that you're communicating via the experience. So yeah, I've got Chris here, creative director, to talk through the team's work on the Resilient Planet Data Hub website and how you use the concept of a page budget to make design choices. So the page budget is something I talked about in the talk back in October. But basically, while you're designing a site, it allows you to flex up and down the amount of CO2 emissions you're allowing per page, like depending on the needs of that page, and where you might allow a higher one on one page, you know, to have a bit more of a wow experience. You will then have to kind of pay that cost back on another area and kind of simplify something there. So yeah, I'll hand over to you, Chris, to chat through what this was about and what your journey was.
Cool. Thanks, Emily. So yeah, that's a really good talking point there, this page budget, and I'm going to be going into it quite a bit. And what I do is I'm going to walk through the conceptual approach to this and how we ended up where we are today. It's worth caveating, as mentioned in some of our previous works as well, that this is a work in progress. This is a classic kind of example of being able to deliver something in time for like a very fast deadline. So we are constantly kind of iterating that, and we're going through processes of re-uploading. So it's kind of one of those like progress types approach to how we kind of iterate and improve as we go. So Resilient Planet Data Hub is an affiliation with the UN. So not to go into it too much, but they essentially provide tools for financial institutions, public sectors, and businesses and communities. And these tools help users find out, based on geographical locations, potential impacts of climate change over the next sort of 10 to 100 years. So with that affiliation with the UN, they had COP coming up, and it was important to be able to create a fast brand and microsite to be able to contain a lot of this information. Not only are they part of kind of the UN, but they're also part of IDF, Insurance, and Oxford University as well. So the clients kind of range from a lot of academics to kind of policy changes and people that are high up in financial. So the brand really needed to be able to kind of work itself in a format in which it was, say, opposite to something that is more kind of Extinction Rebellion, more on kind of finance. So it was a really interesting spectrum to look at from a conceptual area, but I don't want to talk about it too much. I'll jump into the kind of iterations from concept down to what we finally ended up with. So I think one of the first things to really kind of talk about was this idea of like page budget. So we kind of knew going in that we wanted to be able to create visuals that had this like sense of creativity and progressive sort of design, but also wanted to balance the idea of how we can try to build something that worked from an emissions perspective. And I think myself as creative director, I have obviously a certain responsibility to try and push things so they feel different. And I've been in the industry like pre-smartphone, so I've been around for a while. And on the one hand now, we're in this really exciting space where we have access to different softwares. We're moving into an XR environment. We mentioned AI earlier. And we're also in a position where we can quickly generate pieces of design and experience now much faster than we could. So on the one hand, we're able to kind of like, instead of one person spending all of this time kind of building out assets and finely crafting particular kind of bits of digital experience, whether it's 3D or motion graphics or whatever, we're now able to create that faster. So it kind of goes back to some of that theory we were talking about earlier on the causal effect of okay, so it might take, we're shortening that process down, and now everyone, instead of kind of one person generating all this stuff over a long period of time, maybe they get 5 different sort of design solutions. You now have someone that can kind of generate thousands. So it's we need to be really careful about that, running with that excitement of these kind of new ways of progressively doing stuff because of that knock-on effect. And that's when it comes back around to this idea of budget. So when we were designing the page, we were looking at the top area being perhaps that's where we're going to invest in. Well, maybe let's go down like a kind of full width image. One thing we did struggle with a little bit with imagery was the kind of more complicated the pixels that exist within the bitmaps, the more kind of generation it would take, and the harder the processors would take to create it. But we knew that was always giving an issue with this particular sector, as a lot of the imagery needed to really be able to tell the user up front that they can see from normally like a drone perspective the impacts of climate change in a geographical location. So we always knew that that was going to be something that we couldn't work around. There are techniques in which you can kind of create a blurring or depth of field in order to kind of reduce that weight, but in this instance we knew that wouldn't be possible. So in terms of thinking about our budget, we decided that those kind of hero areas were going to be where we'd spend most of the effort, but also have lower pages that were just kind of more minimal in typography. And that kind of like really lent into the design as we went. So moving from this one, we kind of still felt that was a bit heavy. And this kind of section here sort of talks into a little bit about that progressive technology. Before we kind of were consulting so much as we should have been from the start. This goes back to this idea of collaboration. We were I was quite seduced by the idea of being able to build like a 3D globe and have it spinning. So we built it in this software called Spline, which is really cool. However, it was kind of one of those things where when we were looking at the results of that, value versus effort, and in this instance, page cost versus value, didn't quite rationalize it. It wasn't enough. I think that in an event in which this globe concept, this 3D interactive globe concept could work to a point in which it was an interactive piece, you could zoom in, you could click locations, I think we would have like spent all of our budget on that. But because the time that we had to implement something like a 3D, it just felt like it wasn't worth it. It wasn't worth the cost. So we decided to remove it completely. But I think that's a kind of good example there about being seduced by new kind of progressive software to be able to quickly do things that would have taken a longer time before, but to really kind of question that value as to like whether it is 100% required, because it didn't really yield that same level of interactivity as it was if we had spent a longer time coming up with a bigger concept that required 3D.
So being aware of the sustainable design guidelines and the kind of constraints has really kind of shaped the way you were approaching this project and the content in there, and starting to question how much value is this big asset going to add, and is that worth it? You know, if it was worth it, like you say, like if you could make this a really integral part of the website where it's serving a purpose and like working for its value, then maybe. But I kind of think of it a bit like web pages almost, I think they're like 4 times larger than they were in 2010 on average. And I think of it a bit like if a new lane is added to a motorway, right? Like, because everything's got more efficient, and it's like, oh, so we can just fill it up. It's just going to fill up with cars because that power is there. You know, you can add. So it's quite a discipline approach to really start taking away and being like, oh, I can add that thing, and it's really cool, but I've really got to stop and be disciplined and think about what, is it worth it? And if I want to add that, what can I take away instead?
Exactly. It's that idea of taking away somewhere else. So like the sacrifice of its worth rather than chucking all of it there. So that kind of like fed into the kind of conceptual approach, which meant we had to be a bit more playful. Where did the creativity come in? And the way we kind of had the text sort of right, left aligned. We started to bring in more concepts around the way that we formatted the images. So in this instance, we had this idea of, well, perhaps let's go for a larger impact typographic hero area, and then have the subsequent image in more of a kind of letterbox to just sort of reduce the amount of weight that it took up. And also to be quite playful with, when we did use impact imagery, maybe we can be a bit more creative with the aspect ratios of those particular components. So we got that free lockup in the middle there, having a kind of portrait and a landscape mixed in. So it was kind of like, how can we still be creative, but also make sure that we're thinking about how that impact does create that larger weight. So if we move to the next one. So this one was interesting as well. We were kind of consulting with the idea of, at the time, there was lots of kind of information around having brighter colors, created more kind of emissions from domestic monitors. So first, that idea of night mode came in aesthetically as a way to be able to, I guess, from a user experience perspective as well, but to be able to put night mode on when you're in a darker room to like reduce the glare and be able to browse 24/7. But now it's kind of a case of, well, actually, there's almost a knock-on effect of, well, of having darker backgrounds kind of help the amount of light that's produced on the monitors. So we thought, oh, what if we lent into that instead of having a night mode, just kind of make it all black? So that was the kind of concept as well. Ultimately, we didn't go down that route in the end because it came down to it feeling a little bit too dark for the brand itself, and perhaps the darkness kind of had an association with carbon and oil. So we had to kind of get that balance right there. And this is kind of what we ended up with in the end. And it was a case of being able to strip that top area back, just lean in on typography. The dynamic concept came in which we could change that top line proposition so that it kind of felt like there was some kind of dynamic change there. We stripped the image down to that letterbox, and the rest of the page just kind of had really sort of basic kind of like typography and less use of imagery, and the creativity came out in the composition and the layout. And here are some of those lower pages. So this is where we did spend a lot of our budget, was on those large like square ratio images. I felt square was quite cool because it kind of gave you that sort of depth. So you feel like you're immersed into the image a bit more, almost like that POV from a perspective almost. And we knew that this is why it would be hard to kind of blur that image there of the flooding. It would take away the essence of what it was trying to convey. So that's where a lot of our kind of budget spent, and we're still optimizing these images now, like grinding through to try and get like the right result. Cool. And in terms of images, like what could we do? I mean, a lot of people think it is obvious, really. We all, in a way, try to kind of reduce our media to an extent in which we can kind of get that balance of impact and efficiency. And one of the ones on the homepage, for example, it was when we looked in the code, it was huge. And Matt spoke earlier about responsive images that you kind of subject to viewport and stuff like that. But one thing with this one was it was giant, and it was kind of like loading it in, but you only saw a bit of it, so we kind of crop it down. Instead of being a PNG, it was coming in at like 1.7 MBs using like the WebP format. We could drop that down to like 370 KB, so that was good. In terms of like, one thing for designers is a bit confusing when using Photoshop to export as WebP is that it's not in that classic place where it used to be, kind of like save for web. You have to like save a copy as. And then we found that the difference of quality between kind of like super high and high, you may as well kind of take that drop to high, because it didn't really, considering the images that we were looking at that had lots of detail, it didn't make that much difference. And it's worth kind of going with high to save that resolution.
So a bit of experimentation there of like what works for this type of image. And I think it is always going to be a case-by-case basis as well. And you start building up this knowledge of like, okay, well, I've seen this kind of image before, so I know this is the kind of treatment I need to give it to reduce that file size. And it's going to be different to, you know, maybe a portrait image that's got a big blurred background or something.
Yeah, exactly. And this was an interesting one as well, going back to those kind of more square ratios. Our original PNG was coming in at like 2.1, and JPEG was lower, but quality was sort of sacrificed a little bit, and that was coming in at like 2.61. So what we found, again, going through just a kind of standard approach to the sort of WebP, we actually dropped that to 67. But we also did this extra treatment, which kind of worked creative, like from a creative aesthetic perspective in terms of adding to the brand, but also helped in a minor way. But we put like a matte treatment on it. So the image that you could see on the right-hand side has a layer above it set to lighten with an opacity. And that kind of matte texture approach just removes some of the deeper colors. So obviously this can't work on all brands because, you know, there's different guidelines to follow. But for this, we wanted a way of kind of having the images feel consistent and almost like they're slightly journalistic. And it also helped just a little bit. It dropped it from 67 to 57. So that was quite an interesting way of having a filter layer to help also bring that file size down, but tie itself into a creative execution as well.
Mm. Yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it, that like the nature of this brand that you're working with has influenced the way you're approaching design, and the way you're approaching design is influenced back into the brand. So it's kind of going full circle in a way, and creating something unique and creative that you wouldn't have got to if you hadn't had those two things colliding.
Exactly. That's why I think the concepts were important to kind of walk through, because it showed how we started off going quite large, like these concepts of in 3D and stuff like that. And then as we made these discussions and collaborations with Page Budget, we started to kind of strip it back. So the final point to talk about is typography as well. You might have noticed in some of those earlier designs, we kind of experimented with lots of different third-party fonts. We used a font called Inter, and what we were doing manually is kind of reducing the letter space in the code. However, we found out that there was a font called Inter Tight, so it was a tight version of that font. So it just meant that sometimes doing a little bit of due diligence and looking for a variation meant that we only had to upload that font into the system once, and we didn't have to worry about the letter spacing. We also chose to go for 400 and 600 where possible, to try and reduce the amount of different kind of font weights we were using to make that cleaner. And when it comes to more of the sort of serif approach, we were looking at originally using a font called Source. There was like a nice serif font. We wanted it to feel like it had this sense of academia to it. And it was quite, there are some pages on there that have a lot of body copy to read. So we found that sometimes serif font's easier to digest that than a sans font. But instead of going with this kind of third-party Source Pro, we actually just kind of referred back to Georgia system fonts in order to reduce that as well. So that was kind of how we looked at the page budget, to break down exactly where we're going to spend that missions cost, how we reduce those images to as best as possible, still a work in progress, and typography, how we use system fonts and one variation of a third party rather than having them all.
Nice. Thank you so much. That's really interesting to hear like the whole journey through that and how it's kind of influenced your approach. And you know, we're always kind of changing and adapting as designers to new ways of working. So I think it's definitely in everybody's wheelhouse to be embracing this change and seeing it as a challenge as well. So it's really nice to see these beautiful designs coming out.
Cool.
I know we've got 10 minutes left, but I'll move on to my last story and try and make it fast. So we've got time for a question. But this one's about kind of building resilience into digital products and services. So thinking about, you know, what behaviour the services are enabling. So we've already worked with Essex County Council to build an efficient kind of website utilising local gov Drupal, like Matt was mentioning earlier. And then this kind of opportunity came up to for our UX design team to kind of collaborate with the client to encourage more behaviour change in the journeys themselves. So the council, like many of us, are trying to like actively encourage sustainable habits and drive behaviour change to ultimately reduce impact on the environment in their area. However, like we know there's going to be very few people actively going out of their way to like find a website that tells them how to change their behaviour. That's not how people work. So it's up to the teams building these you know, common services, you know, where we know there's going to be a lot of foot traffic going through, to provide nudges at the right time in the right way. So the opportunity presented by this journey is when a user wants to get rid of something and is searching for the local tip or recycling centre. And this search is like a necessity that's going to bring people to the website, like regardless of whether they're interested in sustainability or not. It's just, you know, it's a high traffic place. We know people are going to be using it. So in the new journeys that are being designed and developed, this kind of captive audience are going to be served easy to digest information about how to get rid of their waste in the best possible way. And the content focuses like not only on the benefits to the environment, but also weaves in these kind of other benefits to the individual as well, like saving money, or like the convenience of a different way of getting rid of something. Maybe a charity shop is closer by, you know, than the tip itself, or maybe there's a collection service from, you know, a different type of recycling. So the content itself and the moment the content is displayed are equally as important to consider. So if you get both of those things right, then the result can be really powerful. And in this case, like the further the user gets in their journey, the more personal and relevant we can make that content. So by using that initial search function to like narrow down on the type of waste they're dealing with, you know, we call this kind of adding a speed bump to the journey. The website can then serve them content that challenges their assumptions in the results with the intention of like instilling behavioral change, allowing people to kind of rethink how they're thinking about waste. So the work is still in development here. So yeah, there's been kind of the theme of this. This is a bit of a getting under the hood and behind the scenes view of the things going on. But I'm really personally looking forward to seeing how the results pan out with this one from the team working on it, like the client as well as, you know, the UX team kind of collaborating together, and how this is going to contribute to the overall reduction of waste in that area. And together, like these examples hopefully have illustrated how it takes a community of skills collaborating, but equally as important is the awareness and the willingness of those individuals. So without awareness, these opportunities can be really easily missed. And it takes the willingness of those individuals to make these incremental changes happen. Like we've all got a part to play in this. And, you know, by talking about this stuff and building it into our everyday work, we can make a change. So I hope it's inspired you to take some of this thinking into your own work and see where you can make changes and spot these opportunities. So big thank you for listening, and also a massive thank you to Matt and Chris for joining me and talking me through their work as well. And I'll hand back over to you, Henry, unless there's any final thoughts from Chris or Matt.
No, great.
Awesome. Well, no, thanks, Emily, and yeah, thanks to you guys, Matt and Chris too. Yeah, so much useful information in there, and kind of as Amal Watton said in the chat, yeah, it's just really interesting to see the thought process in kind of how you're kind of balancing creativity and sustainability. Yeah, so thanks to everyone that joined us too. If anyone's got any questions, please do either drop them in the chat or via the Q&A box. Emily, kind of what would be your advice on kind of balancing the needs of kind of clients or stakeholders and also sustainability when they might be at odds with each other? Kind of like are you seeing kind of clients being receptive to these designs, to kind of sustainable design decisions? And if they're not, kind of how would you recommend kind of people approach that?
Yeah, it's a big one, that, isn't it? It's kind of like kind of anticipating people being well, it's not people not wanting to do it. I'm sure it's usually comes down to budget, I imagine, and kind of change and sacrifice and all of those kind of negative things that you feel like are associated with this. But actually, I think there's so many crossovers with good practice in general, with making websites efficient, It's the more efficient a service can be, the better it's going to work for somebody who's accessing your service on a bus, on their phone, So there's so many crossovers with that. And I think a lot of these ones we've talked through today, the more hidden ones, it's just about keeping your eye on this and being aware of it. But then I suppose the other side of it comes down to this idea that regulation is coming. So the selling point, I would say, for this is getting ahead of the game on that. At the moment, there's no standardized methodology for calculating this, but it's happening. There are so many massive brains working on this and coming together and collaborating that those things are going into legislation. It's not going to be long before organizations are going to have to be reporting this stuff and reporting for their ESG reports and all sorts, so there's lots of compelling reasons from different angles, as well as, like I said earlier, you've got those individuals who want to make a change, you've got regulations coming in, but it's going to slowly become more and more mainstream, and then we'll be looking back on it and thinking that was a weird time when we weren't thinking this way. So that would be my answer. I think it's about, I guess, getting your sales hat on and thinking, what are all the different compelling reasons to embrace this and to make it an exciting challenge and ultimately end up with a better product in the end.
Absolutely, thank you. Chris or Matt, I don't know if you want to add anything onto that. But yeah, I think unless anyone's got any more questions, I'll just kind of have one more. What would you say was kind of the biggest kind of quick win, I suppose, from in terms of kind of sustainability from a development perspective and a kind of design perspective, I suppose? Like what kind of changes had the biggest impact?
Well, from a design point of view, I think a big one is assets. We've talked a lot about that today. It's like, check your content, make sure, if you're using images, that firstly they're needed. If you're using videos, that, do you really need it? Cut down on those journeys, like cut all the waffle out, make them really nice and succinct. And make, like Chris was talking through there, make sure if there's an asset on the page, like an animation or an image, that it's actually performing a purpose. Imagine that you're employing it to be there and it's giving you ROI for being there, because it is, there's all these other reasons, and within all the other disciplines as well, you just don't want noise everywhere on the page, so it's kind of easy to cut down on those. So I think it's just another way of that being a quick win for lots of different reasons. It's going to make it easier for users and customers to understand and to navigate, as well as cutting down on the emissions. So yeah, that would be my biggie for design point of view. Development, I'll push over to you, Matt. I can see you grinning. You knew that was coming.
I suspected. Yeah, I think we're quite lucky in many ways, in that things that make websites sustainable from a technology perspective correlate very well to making them fast and responsive and reliable. So that the move towards more cloud native hosting, although there's certainly some disadvantages to that makes things more reliable, and it also reduces the total energy spent. Similarly, smaller images, reducing page weights and things, that correlates very well with people being able to access the site, especially when they're out and about on a poor connection. I think one of the most extreme examples that I can think of for this is when you're trying to access a website on a phone on a train. You're often plugged into the train to charge your phone, which, depending on the train, could be some of the most polluting energy you'll ever use in your life, because it's being produced by a big diesel generator rather than part of the national grid with all of its green energy. But also, you're going through the country at quite high speed, hopefully. You're not necessarily using a reliable internet connection, things are dropping. So being able to load the website quickly is both good for the person, because they get a much more positive user experience, but it's also good for the planet because it's reducing the amount of download and the amount of additional power that's having to be pulled from the train's quite dirty power supply.
I think one thing as well that's quite interesting that we were looking at in terms of sometimes you might want to use like a third party that hosts the media content and pull it through, but then not all of those are green. So there's kind of, it feels like slightly similar to that example there, where you're kind of like shifting that responsibility onto those guys to like sort out the, you know, their kind of emissions and stuff. So there's a bit of a kind of like, yeah, delegation of responsibility there when trying to use like third party media players and stuff, as opposed to kind of uploading it itself. And I think that some of these more sort of softwares that are coming up now, cloud-based softwares, are going to be, it kind of goes back to that point earlier, Emily, where you're talking about the idea of like you solve one problem, but you're creating one somewhere else. I think that that is something to be aware of as well, like how green those providers are for that media, so that if you are using them, to make sure that you're using the right ones.
Yeah.
I think that comes back. So I was going to say that comes back to the point about AWS earlier, because although AWS does have lots of features that allow us to reduce the amount of energy that's being consumed in websites, the fact that they aren't using green energy worldwide, like, is still something they should fix, right? So the fact it shows up as bog standard energy on the site isn't necessarily a reason to panic or a reason not to pick AWS, but it's certainly something that we need to continue feeding back to them and like demanding that they look at improving their stance, because as you say, with third-party providers, we've transferred a lot of responsibility to them, either intentionally or not, and we need to hold them to account and communicate what's important to us as well.
Brilliant, thank you. Yeah, that's just about all we've got time for today. We will have the recording available for you ASAP. So yeah, please do keep an eye on your emails for when that pops up into your inbox. Our next event is virtually our free virtual web accessibility and digital inclusion conference, which is taking place over 3 days on the 14th to the 16th of May. You can find details of that over on our Eventbrite page. So please do sign up. As I mentioned, it is free. We also have tickets for Collaborate Bristol, our Bristol UX and Design Conference. They are on sale now, and you can grab your early bird tickets over on the Collaborate website. Again, Emily, Matt, and Chris, thank you very much, and thank you to everyone that tuned in.
Thank you.